Um, Today is November 25th, 2011, and we would like to know in those years from 1962 to 1965, when you wrote your doctoral dissertation, what things would you point out as difficult questions with a view to advising or people who are writing, or things that someone wants to keep in mind when they're doing a doctorate? This might happen to you, that kind of thing I have in mind, if anything.
It's hard to think. Because the situation for scholars was different then, because there were no photocopiers. There were simply typewriters, there were no computers. So the only information available was books in libraries, and in Oxford many books were underground and could only be obtained at 2 or 3 hour delay and so forth. So nowadays many aspects of scholarship are vastly facilitated by technical advances, and the difference between now and then is now forgotten, not understood. So that's a minor extrinsic kind of consideration, and obviously in itself not relevant as advice, because they don't need to know that was the situation. The problem for all candidates for an English-style doctorate, in which there are no courses, and simply a 2 or 3 year or 3 or 4 year process of private, personal, individual investigation, communication of the written product to a single or a couple of scholars, and then an eventual thesis. The problem is to determine the boundaries of the work, and that problem involves an element of fortuity, chance, providential good fortune, or its absence. So one's initial selection, hypothetical selection of the topic, may prove on investigation to be too wide, or sometimes too narrow, or simply sometimes not suitable. Or, as happened to one of my students only 2 or 3 years ago, having done 2/3 of the work over 2 years, this student discovered that the very same topic had been published. She found the book in the bookshop, completely covered, no more, no less, and the project was destroyed. So that's an obstacle again, about which not much advice can be given, except to do an early bibliographical search. But then even a bibliographical search would not have revealed that the other author was already about to publish this work. So there is a hazard in these projects, and partly that can be alleviated by diligent bibliographical work, and partly it can't. Secondly, I would say, in respect of that kind of necessary diligence, the candidate should not assume, at least in the kinds of fields with which I'm familiar, should not assume that the supervisor or any other particular scholar will be such a master of the field that their advice is a secure and sound criterion for deciding whether or not to pursue the bibliographical research. I've no doubt that there are some fields especially in relation to the sort of closed world of classical scholarship, where all the materials are essentially discovered centuries ago, and scholars sort of circle around that, and progress is made, but the field is well defined. In such a field, I think one may find scholars on whose judgment one could rely. They can tell you has been done, this has not been done, not being done. You're safe. I recommend this project. I have never been in a position to recommend a project on that kind of basis, and I think not very many scholars are in that position. So the candidate must, from the outset, I think, assume that that he or she is, so to speak, on their own, self-reliant, and not taking too much on trust from the supervisor.
Let me ask you some more questions on this same topic. First, a very short one. Did every one of you have a typewriter? Where were the typewriters otherwise?
Well, I wrote my thesis for at least 2 years in handwriting. So my supervisor read much of my work in my handwriting, which was very superior to his. So I am one of the few people in the world who can read my supervisor's writing, because I would spend a substantial amount of time after he had returned my chapter with his annotations. I spent a substantial time deciphering one word at a time, word by word, what his comments were. I think that probably in my 3rd year, when chapters, as it were, ready to be incorporated in the thesis were being composed, I think I then acquired a small typewriter and taught myself to type with 2 or 3 fingers. But at the end of that, I had to give the text to a typist to produce the thesis.
Right.
Because my typing would produce a significant number of mistakes, and of course in those days mistakes could not effectively be corrected.
Of course. So the next question in the same boundary. Did you ever experience what is called writer's block while you were doing your thesis?
I don't have a clear memory. I expect I did, but I did in fact settle early on a topic which did prove to be sufficiently self-contained and big enough and not too big to have always some rather definite particular project. So to understand what Aristotle had said about not all the questions or even many of the questions that Aristotle deals with, but simply a very limited set of questions about the structure of governmental authority. And then after Aristotle, well, nobody much deals with this during the Middle Ages, and so one can skip forward and maybe said a few things about maybe Aquinas or something like that. But then I go to Bentham, and I again am considering Bentham in some well-defined aspect, though it then becomes very interesting to consider Bentham's deeper theory, and so there is a danger then of going off the track. But even when going off the track, the result is not writer's block, but a problem of selection. So I don't think I experienced a problem of simply sitting in front of the page and being unable to.
Do you believe such thing exists?
Of course.
Have you heard of it?
No, I know it exists.
Okay. Okay. No general remedy for it.
Well, the remedy for it is to find something completely concrete to do, like to read all the last 5 articles on some topic and write 1 page or 50 pages on it.
Yeah, perfect. Now, 2 questions connected to supervision. So what you said about supervision and the topic. as you know, in Spain and in other parts of Europe, and maybe elsewhere, I don't know, the supervisor has an important role in the choice of topic. Not only that, many times in Italy, for example, a given professor has a line of research and recruits students and gives topics for thesis and so on and so forth. So the first part of the question is, what do you think of this style of doing things? The second part, if you want to make the two together, because the second is more tricky. We were talking yesterday about your self-reflections on supervision in context of conversations I had with Stephen Smith, and you said something like, I wondered and I wonder whether correcting style and not going more into substance, if I understood correctly, was the right thing. So the second question would be, what is your conclusion as of today? What is your balance? What does a supervisor have to do?
Well, I quite admire the Italian or whatever practice of professorial distribution of topics to suitable students. If you have a list of topics that you want to be pursued, then that's a benefit that you can confer on your students. If they are looking for something and you have something to offer, then offer it. But my work has never been such that I had anything to offer, really. It would have been had I wanted to conduct my scholarly research in, say, administrative law or something of that sort, but never has been. Even when I was teaching those subjects, they were never what I was really interested in researching in. So, I have nothing against and much in favour of that practice. So de facto, all the maybe 50 or 60 doctoral students that I have supervised have come essentially with their own, at least hypothetical topic, and my initial advice my initial role has been only to say, well, that's too big or not, but not to offer an alternative. And so my unreadiness to offer large structural advice, which you're referring to in the second question, partly is the consequence of what I described in relation to the first, that I didn't have anything particular of a scholarly, validated nature to offer. So I look at the work of my students and I ask myself, does it make sense? Is it coherent? Does the sequence of chapters make sense? Is in this particular section there a coherent argument, or is there not? In this paragraph, is there a coherent movement of thought or not? And to make my criticisms simply in the face of what I would have been offered, not to look outside to see what lies beyond. So I think that's has been a deficiency, but it had the advantage for the law faculty that they could send students to somebody who didn't know much about their field but was willing to do that.
How was it a deficiency? In what sense would it have been?
Well, it obviously would have been better if I had been able to not only do what I have described, but also offer positive recommendations about what field to investigate.
Other than that, that's your retrospective thought about this matter. Bring any other consideration that one may call self-critical, or say, if I would have had to do it again, that kind of thing? For example, do you think it was a waste of time, of your time, to go into the minor grammatical English things? That's one possible way of seeing it. Or do you think you should have gone farther than consistency, etc.?
Well, as I say, I would prefer to have gone further than consistency, but that depends on what I could have offered. And I'm not saying I never had anything to offer, I just say I would like to have offered more. But for many students, the alternative was not being accepted to Oxford because nobody else was willing to supervise. So I supervised 3 whole doctorates about Indian land rights or indigenous people's land rights in Canada. I knew nothing about indigenous people's land rights. I knew nothing about Canada. I had never been to Canada. I had no interest in Canada. But I was willing to read the historical sources of Canadian law and English 18th century history enough to supervise the thesis or to investigate when the student asserted a proposition and asserted an authority or a source. To look at the source, I was willing to look at the source and say, no, it doesn't say that, and nobody else in the faculty was, so those students could not have done the doctorate in Oxford had there not been someone like me who was willing to do that. So I don't feel altogether apologetic about that, but it clearly is something I would like to mean otherwise. Now there's another aspect.
Style, wasting time?
No, it's not a waste of time, I think, because when I examine a thesis, if the style is defective in the way that I correct in draft, then I soon develop a very negative judgment about the whole thesis, and the whole thesis is in danger of being rejected, the 3 years' work, or 4 years' work, or 5 years' work wasted because the examiners reject it. Now, some examiners have a much more relaxed view of I'm not talking about style so much as actual errors or clumsiness, which is not merely stylistic or elegant, but a deficiency,
yes,
scholarly weakness. I think it's a big service to young scholars to provide that kind of criticism. And I think on the whole that has been valued by my students, so I don't regard it as wasted time. I do sometimes ask myself whether it is legitimate for me to correct the final draft of the thesis,
right,
to the extent that I do. And some Oxford scholars whose judgment I value refuse to engage in that, including some of my close colleagues in the law faculty, who are generous people, but they refuse to correct the final draft.
Is it because they think it's the responsibility of the student?
Yeah. But I have never been willing to stop.
Yes.
If the student showed me the final draft, I continued to correct it. So that has good results and bad results, and so the bad result is that some students who perhaps in some sense should have failed passed. So
Right. There is a phrase that you mentioned once, and I made popular here among my students, that has to do with this. And since this was supposed to be a dialogue, I will say that what I recall was that Santiago, if I get distracted by the small picture, I can't focus on the big picture. of course, now your retrospective was about the big picture. But anyway, maybe we can move to the next thing, which is teaching. So these are my queries regarding teaching. Before going to Africa, you teach both in Oxford and in the US, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And in Australia.
And in Australia. And after returning from Africa, you teach in many other places. So my first question is, with respect to Oxford, both pre-Malawi and post-Malawi, of all the maybe 6, 7, 8 classes that you taught, which is the one you enjoyed the most? In tutorials and seminars and whatever that...
I think I enjoyed most the lectures that I gave in jurisprudence, legal philosophy, to undergraduates, not in my college, although my college students might be there, but in the university, as we say, to people from any college, not to graduates, not a graduate seminar, not to other scholars, although as a matter of fact there were often graduate students.
Trinity term, right?
It might be Trinity term.
Yes, lectures and jurisprudence.
Yeah. So working on them was very stimulating, and a lot of the ideas in natural law and natural rights were developed. A lot of the critique of Hart, of Kelson, and of other major figures in the Anglo tradition emerged from those lectures. So that's something. Of course, giving seminars with Dworkin and Raz never failed to be interesting and worthwhile. So I would put that up on much the same.
Okay, so let's go first to the first ones. Was there any interaction in those lectures of Trinity terms with the young people?
Well, as I remember, not much. I didn't particularly encourage it. I didn't do anything to consciously discourage it, but the Oxford style of anonymous attendance by those who chose to attend has its advantages and disadvantages. I particularly, one can illustrate this by, so I went to Australia in 1971, I think, and I spent 2 Oxford terms and the Oxford summer vacation in Australia, and that was one whole academic year in Australia, and I taught the compulsory jurisprudence class for the whole of the Adelaide Law School. So there were maybe 80 or 100 students, and they were my students to be taken through that course from the beginning to the end.
Did you say 80 to 100?
Yes.
Okay.
And then I would examine them at the end, and I would mark the examination and so forth. Now, the material that I had delivered in the Hillary term immediately preceding that, 8 weeks in maybe 2 lectures a week, 1 or 2 lectures a week, that material easily extended through the whole year. And so, as you can infer, that involved discussion and so forth.
Australian.
In Australia.
So
now that I thought was never possible in Oxford. The class was not yours, people could come, people could go, so there was a kind of anonymity to it. I would come in and I'd give my lecture and then I'd leave.
So in that sense, would you say that the Australian experience compares more to the Berkeley experience than to Oxford in terms of participation and all that?
Well, the Berkeley experience was quite different because my responsibility as one of six associates in law was to teach legal writing and use of the library and use of legal sources for maybe 3 or 4 weeks of each of 2 semesters. So after 4 weeks, say 3 or 4 weeks, those duties were completed essentially, and the 6 of us were free to pursue whatever interests we had, and some one went to the beach and lay on the beach, and one did I do not know what, filmmaking, and one, like me, went into the main university library and walked through the stacks of the library,
Kelson,
looking and Griset and Lonergan and so forth.
Griset and Lonergan were
yes, I discovered
here?
Griset's review of Lonergan's Insight was something I found more or less accidentally in the stacks.
Is that right? Had you already come through Griset by then? Had you already come through Griset?
No, that's
I think that's your first contact.
Yes, I think so.
Look,
yeah.
You don't find this in Argentina.
No.
But there is one here.
Yeah.
Joaquin Migliore, who was the tyranny person talking about Sandel, gave me that as a present because he knew it would mean something for good. So yeah, Berkeley cannot be compared.
No,
maybe Notre Dame.
Well, actually, I did participate then, by choice, in a couple of courses being taught by big professors. So I participated in the constitutional law course. Participated in the sense that I audited, as Americans would say, most of the course, and I actually took 2 or 3 classes. 70 students, and
took, meaning that you
I conducted the class for the hour or whatever in place of the professor.
But audited all of the semester.
Most of it, yes.
Taught by, we don't remember.
Yes, I don't remember the name of it. He was a young, mainline tenured full professor, and I worked with him, on his constitutional law project. But so I did have some exposure to American law school classes, both his and John Fleming's class in torts. And I formed a view about the so-called Socratic method, in which the professor conducts the class by asking students questions.
You formed a view?
I formed a view,
yes,
and I formed a negative view.
A negative view. Why so?
At least negative about one aspect of the way it was done especially by Fleming, but to some extent also by the constitutional law professor, namely that they, by and large, abstained from asserting any final proposition. After all the discussion, I think it's the duty of the teacher to formulate a proposition, and indeed to argue for a sequence of propositions. And on the whole, they seem to me to be too abstemious about that. So when I taught the constitutional law class, I asserted propositions, and I did some questioning and so forth, but I thought always it was necessary to draw the conversation to a conclusion.
Did you perceive a negative reaction from these students used to
I don't have any memory of a negative reaction, no.
What about the legal writing experience?
I have very little memory of that. And I couldn't now tell you whether we conducted it in a sequence of small groups or whether it was quite a substantial group, namely the whole of the first year class divided by 6, which might be 40 or something, and I can't remember how I taught it.
But let me put it differently. What do you think of this presently pervading idea that legal writing is really rubbish and that what we need is plain English writing and we need to combat legal writing? That people don't write properly in law, we need to go back to basics.
Well, I think that's probably substantially true. I mean, in Oxford we don't teach legal writing or anything of that sort. We simply assign an essay topic in the college tutorial, and then the student comes with an essay, and the question is whether the essay makes sense, and whether it's written in a coherent manner, not in some special legal manner. So I think there is room for teaching students how to use sources, how to cite sources, but that can be done actually very quickly. And in Oxford we tend to assume that the students can simply pick it up without any instruction. That what they need instruction in is being self-critical about syntax and sequence of thought and logical coherence. And
can you think how to teach them that? Is there a way?
Well, to listen,
to teach to write well.
read what they write and correct it in the way that you referred to earlier.
For example, in your experience, would you say that reading good language, reading good English has any variance
yes,
on writing?
So those who are in difficulties in these respects, I have often usually said, well, read the good judges' judgments and from time to time stop thinking about the legal argument and the particular reason why you've been told to read this case, and instead simply read a paragraph as a piece of English composition. Notice how it's done, and notice how each sentence is done, how it reads well, and so just look at it, think about it. I haven't got much more to offer than that.
I'll offer you something more since they want me to dialogue with you, although it's not the first time I've mentioned it to you, I think. And that is the possibility of giving to that American legal English student who did a BA in chemistry, or to an English student that doesn't come from a public school, novels, good novels to be written by the masters of the English language or the Spanish for that matter. Do you think that that can have some kind of effect on the way they write?
I don't know. I would assume it might. So I've never done that, but I have nothing against it if people are willing to read a novel of such a kind. But I'd never had the nerve, or I could never dare to suggest such a thing.
Right. Yes. Maybe I was thinking more along the lines of, oh yes, I know that Hart or X that wrote really, really well read Proust or X in French or I don't know what, and that is clear from his prose. He was a cultivated person. He didn't read the Law Quarterly Review, just that kind of thing, in the, like, looking back.
Well, there's some truth in that. Actually, Hart makes a lot of syntactical mistakes, but his prose is not bad.
Though I wasn't meaning Hart. I said Hart just as a guess.
Yeah.
I might have said Cross or I don't know what.
Yeah.
Brasher. I don't know.
Yeah.
Whatever.
No, as I say, I think if they read Evil and War and read it intelligently, then they might, the style, the elegance, the clarity might rub off on them. They might learn.
Rub off would be like what, for purposes of translation? Imprint?
Imprint itself on them,
yeah.
As it were, unconsciously, as the reading flows
yeah.
by. Yeah.
As in the twilight.
Without the intention to learn.
Yeah. Okay.
So somebody brushes against your sleeve and leaves a mark. He
yeah.
didn't intend it. You didn't intend it. But
yeah.
it's left.
Now let's assume that that happens. We don't know why because we haven't studied it properly. And then this person starts to write law, for example, a TEFL, or an article, he's a doctor, or a book, he's a professor, and you notice he's working, or someone X. People say, he doesn't write like a lawyer, this is more beautiful. It is precise enough, but it's not so technically perfect. So, is there a risk, is there a boundary, is there a concern about, so to speak, novels for lawyers? Writing lawyers?
Well, I don't know. I think So when I practiced at the bar and pleaded causes, so set up as we say, the pleadings, stating the necessary facts and the cause of action and moving the court to intervene, one adopts a kind of formality in the face of the court, not of course literally in the face of the court, but with a view to it being read by in the end, by judicial officers, judges and masters and so forth. And of course of being read by the hostile opponents' lawyers, and so one adopts a kind of formality which has elements of the ponderous and over-formal about it, but it also has some merits. And so one rightly avoids idiomatic phrases whose meaning depends on the assumptions which may be not shared amongst the potential readers. And it's that avoidance of the metaphorical, the idiomatic, the current, what English critics used to call cant, without the cant in English, of course, has meaning of false, a meaning of spurious and false, but they meant the trendy, popular, no, C-A-N-T.
Okay.
So that's an old-fashioned use of the word cant, and it meant the use of popular idioms which may exist only for 5 years and then go out of circulation. So one has to strip out all that kind of prose. And if you looked at Dworkin, or even if you looked at the concept of law, you'd find some quantity of that kind of idiomatic writing. Not much, but some. Too much for formal legal pleadings.
Pleadings in courts, you mean?
Well, the pleading, in the sense of the word that I'm using, is the set of documents which create a lease, of course, lease inter partes, a cause of action, but legal proceedings.
But a legal philosopher normally writes for a different audience.
Yeah, so I'm just saying you asked me whether there is legal writing.
Yeah.
And I'm saying yes, there is, and it's legitimate, and its over formality is not excessive for its purpose.
That is clear.
But if you then offered a book on anything really, written in such prose, readers would find that
tedious,
exceptionally tedious and even repellent, rebarbative, as we say.
Yes. Well, readers find that that's often the case in Argentina and in the US. Hence this movement called plain English. We have other problems. Well, and that takes us to one of our two last topics of conversation. As you know, this dialogue will be published in the law journal of this university, of the Pontifical Catholic University. So this question will have to do with the idea of Catholicity in the term Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina. And the question won't be so much about Argentina or the US or anything like that, which would be unfair, but and not about the documents, what is in the documents that we all know, whether we follow them or not, but rather what is it that today, on your view, could justify that we have a Catholic university, given that there are in Oxford, here, in so many places, good parishes and so on and so forth, and think tanks and good secular schools?
Well, it is for me quite a difficult question to reach a judgment about, because there were in my time in Australia no Catholic tertiary institutions, except I suppose outside my horizon, teachers' colleges, training of teachers for schools, about which I knew nothing. And I think probably in my state, South Australia, there was no Catholic teacher training college. They were, I later discovered, in other states. And then I spent my whole career essentially in an English secular university. And in England there were no Catholic tertiary institutions, except some teacher training colleges and of course seminaries for the training of priests, a few of those. And I myself valued the experience of teaching in a secular university and doing my Catholic stuff in the fellowship, in the context of a secular university, and I found little difficulty in adjusting my whole style of approach to students and teaching students to the presupposition that they are completely uninterested in Catholicism or hostile to it, and that is not a topic that comes into question or play or in any shape.
So, I suppose you were telling me about Notre Dame? Or?
Well, no, I was talking about Oxford.
Yeah, I know.
And then I was about to say that, so I valued the experience of doing that in the purely secular university, although it had some negative consequences. Namely that, as I said earlier, most of my actual research and so on was something I didn't want to communicate to my students. So in my undergraduate courses in jurisprudence, which was the heart of my college teaching, 6 or 8 hours a week, not entirely in jurisprudence, but not mostly in jurisprudence, I couldn't, at least I was not even willing to recommend my own book, Natural Law and Natural Rights, except as an option for those who are interested in the final 1 or 2
Sorry, why not? There are several possible reasons, that's why I asked. Why not?
Yes. Well, I had no intent to do anything that could be interpreted as proselytizing.
Okay.
Now, then I started teaching also in Notre Dame, and I started doing that amongst other reasons for the reason that I wanted to experience the alternative, namely of teaching in a Catholic university where, although by far not all the students are Catholics, still the presumption is that if you come to this university then you will be exposed to Catholic teaching, and that's part of the deal, and if you don't like it you don't have to come. But many people have come precisely because they want to investigate or to be carried further in the Catholic intellectual tradition, both in its precisely theological form, but also in its non-theological, but rather philosophical or quasi-philosophical forms. Now, although I haven't taught mainstream legal subjects in Notre Dame, Indiana, I would rather have taught optional subjects precisely on Thomas Aquinas. I have taught Notre Dame students in London all these years, and there I have taught what you might call a sort of mainline jurisprudence course. And I think I probably haven't used that opportunity as fully as I might have or should have. Now, to answer your question, I think there's no question but that parishes cannot possibly provide a substitute for Catholic tertiary institutions in which the Catholic judgments about the whole range of scientific questions, as well as Catholic ambience in relation to student life, are consciously and self-critically maintained and projected as a mission, that all that is needed and valuable, always vulnerable to, on one hand, the hijacking of the institution by radicals or progressives or people filled with antipathy to the Catholic tradition, or on the other hand, the danger of falling into an incurious, routinized transmission of a Catholic tradition. So, with those two constant dangers, nonetheless, the central project seems to be desirable and necessary. So, Australian Catholic culture, English Catholic culture, gravely weakened by the absence of such institutions.
You mentioned that you accepted Notre Dame's offer partly because you wanted to experience that. While doing that, did you turn off any other offer from the US that did not involve this Catholic component? In which case I move to our last topic of conversation, which could be labeled Argentina, so to speak. And I could start it and finish it like this, or otherwise I might help provide further questioning. You have been here 3 times, in 2001, 2007, and now 10 years after your first visit again. So, what, if anything, has caught your eye about Buenos Aires, their people, the academia, the food, the air, whatever?
Well, obviously, coming to Buenos Aires 10 years after 2001, one notices a very great change in the appearance and surface of the city. Instead of an atmosphere of depression and kind of dirtiness to the city, now that can still be found as in any city, but nonetheless the kind of freshness and also obviously economic activity succeeding and so forth. The city looks more beautiful and seems to be functioning well. Although the taxi driver will describe the traffic rightly as horrendous, still this is simply an incident of a vigorous urban life. So that's the superficial level. Of course, what I have found particularly striking and fascinating about my experiences in Argentina include notably, as I tell people on those occasions where the matter arises in England, is the very lively and extensive interest of those Argentinians whom I've had the privilege of meeting here in the wider world, in English culture, but of course not only English, but French and German and Spanish and Italian and so forth. But so what particularly interests me is the way in which English novels and literary works and historical works are part of the texture of the thought and the spirit of the people whom I've had the good fortune to meet. I mean, that's a very striking phenomenon and one that I've not encountered anywhere else. That's a primary attraction for me to coming to And that hasn't been so much part of the formal academic occasions here, although it's not absent from that. But in the informal dinners, this has manifested itself in a very striking way.
Very good. Excellent. We're off then. Gracias.